The mountain town of Ridgecrest sat nestled between two peaks like a secret kept by the earth itself. Snow fell in lazy spirals that December evening, dusting the wooden buildings and dirt roads with a clean white that would be trampled brown by morning. In the corner saloon, warm light spilled through fogged windows, and inside, the smell of whiskey and wood smoke hung thick in the air. Thomas Brennan sat hunched over his fourth drink, his weathered face flushed and eyes glazed. Beside him, pressed into the corner of the booth, sat a girl of 19 with honey, colored hair braided down her back. She kept her eyes fixed on her folded hands, her posture rigid as a fence post. Her name was Sarah, and she'd learned long ago that making herself small sometimes made her father forget she was there. "I'll bet you $20 and this deed," Thomas slurred, slapping a crumpled paper on the table. The men around him laughed, but it was the uncomfortable kind of laughter that comes when nobody knows quite what to do. "Tom, you're drunk," said Pete Morrison, the blacksmith. "Take your girl home." "My girl?" Thomas's voice rose, bitter and raw. "She's useless to me. Can't hear a damn thing I say. Her mother died bringing her into this world deaf, and she's been nothing but a burden since." He turned to Sarah, speaking loudly as if volume would somehow reach her. "Isn't that right?" Sarah's eyes flickered up briefly, taking in her father's face, reading the anger there like she'd learned to read the weather in the sky. She signed something with her hands, a fluid gesture that meant, "Let's go home, Papa." He batted her hands away. None of that gibberish. The saloon had grown quiet. Even the piano player had stopped his rolling tune. In the corner, a man stood up from his table. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years working timber and stone. His dark hair was shot through with gray at the temples, and his face was tanned and lined from mountain sun and wind. His name was William Cross, though most called him Will, and he'd come down from his cabin higher up for supplies and perhaps a bit of human company. He walked to Thomas's table with measured steps. "I'll take that bet," Will said quietly. Thomas looked up, squinting. "The bet's over, mountain man. These cowards won't play. I said I'll take it." Will pulled out a leather pouch and counted out $20 in coins and bills. $20 says I can drink you under this table, and when I win, I get the deed and the girl. The saloon erupted in murmurs. Pete Morrison stood up. "Will, you can't be serious." "I'm stone sober and dead serious." Will's gray eyes never left Thomas's face. "You in or not?" Something mean and desperate flickered in Thomas's expression. "You want a deaf girl who can't do a day's work. Fine by me. But when you lose, I get your money and that silver watch I've seen you wearing." Will pulled out his father's watch, the only thing of value he owned besides his land, and set it on the table. "Deal." They shook hands, and the bartender, seeing no way out of this madness, began lining up shots. Sarah sat frozen, her heart hammering so hard she thought others might hear it. She'd understood nothing of the words spoken, but she'd seen money exchanged, seen her father's cruel smile, seen the mountain man's steady gaze. She knew, with the instinct of someone who'd learned to read the world without sound, that her life was being wagered in this smoke-filled room. The first shot went down, then the second. Thomas was already drunk, but pride and meanness kept him reaching for glass after glass. Will drank steadily, his hand never shaking. After the 8th shot, Thomas's head began to loll. After the 10th, he slumped forward. After the 12th, he slid under the table entirely, unconscious. The saloon was silent. Will stood up, steady as a pine. He gathered the deed, left his money on the bar to cover the drinks, and turned to Sarah. She was staring at him with wide eyes, golden, brown and bright with unshed tears. He made a simple gesture, pointing to the door, then to himself, then to her. The meaning was clear: come with me. She hesitated, looked at her father's crumpled form, then back at Will. She'd spent 19 years watching her father drink away her mother's memory and blame Sarah for a loss she'd had no part in causing. What life was there left for her in that house that smelled of whiskey and resentment? She stood and followed the mountain man out into the snow. The walk to Will's cabin took 2 hours up winding trails dusted white. He walked ahead with a lantern, checking back often to make sure she was keeping pace. Sarah followed, her thin coat poor protection against the cold, but she didn't complain. Complaining required a voice she'd never had reason to develop. When they reached the cabin, Will pushed open the heavy door and lit lamps inside. The interior was simple but well built. A stone fireplace, a thick rug, shelves lined with books, a sturdy table and chairs, a bed in one corner with quilts stacked high. He gestured for her to come in, then set about building up the fire. The warmth began to seep into Sarah's bones, and she realized she was shaking, not just from cold, but from fear and uncertainty and a strange, fragile hope. Will brought her a cup of hot tea and a blanket. He pointed to the bed, then to himself, then to the rug by the fire. She understood. The bed was hers. He would sleep by the hearth. She shook her head and pointed to the rug, then to herself. Her fingers moved in signs. I am the servant here. I will take the floor. Will watched her hands, and something shifted in his expression. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently stilled her hands with his own. Then he did something that made her breath catch. His own hands began to move in signs, uncertain and clearly unpracticed, but unmistakable. You are not a servant, he signed. You are a person. The bed is yours. Sarah's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over. In 19 years, no one had ever spoken to her in her own language. No one had ever tried. She signed back, her hands trembling. You know the hand. Language. Will nodded. His signs came slowly as he explained. I spent 2 years in a school back east. There was a boy there, a good friend, who was deaf. He taught me. I'm rusty, but I remember. Why? She asked simply. Will was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. Because I saw you in that saloon. He finally signed. I saw how you made yourself small, how you watched your father's face to know if danger was coming, how you tried to sign to him, and he batted your hands away like you were a pest. He paused. My mother used to say that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's just a different kind of language. I figured it was time I practiced that language again. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She had 1,000 questions, but the one that came out was, what happens now? Now, Will signed. Now you rest. Tomorrow we figure out the rest. But I promise you this, you're safe here. You don't owe me anything, not work, not gratitude, nothing. When the spring comes, if you want to go somewhere else, I'll help you get there. If you want to stay, you can stay. The choice is yours. It was the first choice Sarah had been offered in her entire life. She nodded, unable to sign anything more through her tears. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Will would wake early and make breakfast simple food, but warm and plentiful. He showed Sarah around the cabin and the land, explaining his work. He was a carpenter and sometimes a guide for hunters and travelers. He kept chickens and a milk cow, had a large garden in the summer, and traded goods with the town below. His life was solitary but sufficient. Sarah began to help without being asked, not from obligation, but from a desire to contribute. She had a gift with the chickens, gentle hands that could coax the shyest hen to lay. She organized his chaotic shelves, mended his clothes with tiny, precise stitches, and began to prepare meals with a creativity that surprised them both. Will had been living on venison stew and fried potatoes for years. Sarah somehow made the same ingredients sing. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and Will would practice his signing. He was terribly rusty at first, often mixing up signs or fingerspelling entire sentences when his vocabulary failed him. But he was patient with himself, and Sarah was patient with him, and slowly, haltingly, they began to talk. She told him about her mother, who she'd never met, but who lived in her imagination as a woman with gentle hands and a soft smile. She told him about growing up in a house where she was seen as broken, about learning to read lips and faces and the subtle shifts of mood that warned her when to hide. She told him about the library in town where the librarian, Mrs. Chen, had secretly taught her to read and write, giving her books to take home and hide under her bed. Will told her about his own past. He'd been married once, years ago, to a woman named Elizabeth. They'd lost a baby, a daughter who'd been born too early and lived only 3 hours. Elizabeth had never recovered from the grief. She'd grown distant, then cold, then one day she'd simply left. He'd found a note saying she'd gone back east to her family. That had been 12 years ago. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd remarried, had other children, built a different life. He didn't begrudge her that, but he'd never felt inclined to try again himself, until now. He signed one evening in late January, then seemed surprised he'd said it. Sarah felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. "Why me?" she signed. "I'm nothing special. I'm the girl nobody wanted." Will set down the wood he'd been whittling and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "You know what I see when I look at you," he signed. "I see someone who learned to speak with her hands when the world wanted her silent. Someone who reads emotions like I read weather patterns. Someone who makes a cabin feel like a home for the first time in over a decade. Someone who's kind to chickens and patient with a rusty old mountain man trying to remember his signs." He paused. "Your father was a fool. His loss is my gain." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, some frozen place she'd kept locked away. She signed back, "I think I'd like to stay, if the offer is still good in spring." "It's good," Will signed. "It's good now, and it'll be good then, and it'll be good whenever you need it to be." The winter deepened and then began to loosen its grip. By March, the snow was melting in earnest, turning the paths to mud and revealing the brown earth beneath. Sarah had ventured down to the town a few times with Will, walking by his side as they picked up supplies. She'd seen her father once, stumbling out of the saloon. He'd looked at her, but his eyes had slid away, unable or unwilling to acknowledge what he'd done. Sarah had felt a pang, but not of longing. It was more like grief for something she'd never had and now knew she never would. Mrs. Chen at the library had embraced her, tears streaming down her kind face. "I'm so glad you're safe," she'd said, speaking slowly so Sarah could read her lips. "I worried about you in that house." Sarah had introduced her to Will, and Mrs. Chen had immediately begun signing, her hands moving with practiced fluency. "You're the mountain man who won her from her father," she signed, studying him critically. "I prefer to think I gave her a choice." Will signed back. Mrs. Chen had smiled then, a broad genuine smile. "Good answer. You take care of our girl, you hear. She's special." "I know." Will had signed, and the sincerity in his face had made Mrs. Chen nod with satisfaction. On an evening in early April, as the first green shoots were appearing in Will's garden and the chickens were laying with renewed enthusiasm, Sarah and Will sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The air was mild, filled with the smell of pine and new growth. Sarah's hands moved in the language that had become their bridge. "I've been thinking," she signed. dangerous pastime, Will signed back with a small smile. She laughed, a sound she'd never made much of before because she couldn't hear it, couldn't judge if it was right or wrong. But around Will, she'd started to laugh more, feeling the vibration in her chest and not caring how it sounded. "I want to learn more," she signed. "Mrs. Chen said there are schools, places where deaf people go to learn trades, to meet others like them. I'd like to go. Not forever." She added quickly, seeing something flicker in Will's expression. "Just for a while, a few months, maybe a year, to learn, to grow, and then I'd come back." Will was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands still. Then he signed, "Is that what you really want?" "Yes," she signed. "But only if you'll wait for me, only if I have something to come back to." Will reached out and took her hands, not to still them, but to hold them gently in his own. "I'll wait," he signed, though he had to release her hands to do it. "I'll be here when you're ready to come back. And Sarah, I'll be proud of you, learning and growing. That's what people do when they're loved. They help each other become more of who they're meant to be." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but they were different tears than the ones she'd cried that first night. These were tears of gratitude, of joy, of feeling seen and valued and precious. She leaned forward and kissed Will's weathered cheek, then pulled back and signed, "Thank you, for seeing me when I was invisible, for speaking my language when no one else would, for giving me choice and time and space to figure out who I am. Thank you." Will signed back, "For taking a chance on a rusty old mountain man who didn't know how lonely he was until you showed up and made him remember what it felt like to have someone to talk to." They sat together as the stars began to emerge, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, speaking in silence, building something new from broken pieces. Sarah would go to the school in the fall. She would learn bookbinding and meet other deaf students, and discover a whole community she'd never known existed. And when she came back a year later, knowledgeable and confident and more herself than she'd ever been, Will would be waiting on that porch, his hands ready to catch her signs and his cabin ready to become their home. But in that moment on the April evening, all of that was still future. In that moment, there was just the mountain air and the fading light and two people who'd learned that sometimes the most profound things are said without a single sound, that being heard has nothing to do with volume and everything to do with attention, and that love, real love, always learns to speak the language of the beloved. The mountains stood eternal around them, keeping their secrets and bearing witness to one more small miracle. A girl who'd been called worthless discovering her own value, and a man who'd forgotten how to hope, learning to believe in new beginnings. In the silence between them, there was more conversation than most people have in a lifetime of noise. And that was how Sarah, the girl her father had thrown away, found herself caught not by a mountain man, but by simple human decency, by the willingness of one person to see another truly, and by the quiet truth that the softest voices sometimes carry the most powerful messages. You just have to know how to listen.